It's 7 o'clock. I'm Dermot Monahan. This is a Sky News question and answer programme about the cost of living crisis featuring our panel of experts. The headlines. A dark day for drivers. The price to fill up the average family car hits yet another record high, passing £100.
It made me feel a bit sick just watching it go up and up and up. I couldn't believe that it was that much.
And there are calls for a fuel price checker to keep prices lower, as they do in Northern Ireland, to be introduced across the UK. The Prime Minister pledges to make it easier to get onto the property ladder as he seeks to reassure people struggling to make ends meet.
We're on your side in cutting transport costs. We're on your side in cutting the costs of home ownership. And of course, we are on your side in cutting the tax bill as fast as you responsibly can.
Well, coming up, our panel will be answering your questions about petrol prices, energy bills, and some of the possible solutions. A very good evening. It's been described as a truly dark day for drivers, and the RAC is warning of darker days ahead. It now costs more than £100 to fill up an average family car with a 55-litre tank. So it adds to the pressure on millions of people as there continues to be a cost of living crisis. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister has attempted to rebrand his leadership with a speech in Blackpool, hinting at more tax cuts to come and announcing more help for first-time buyers to get on the property ladder. Coming up, we'll be doing our best to answer the questions you've been sending to us throughout the day. Let's take you through some of the numbers about the cost of petrol and diesel. Well, it's been rising sharply this year. Unleaded petrol is 37% more expensive than this week 1 year ago. Diesel is also up now, averages just over 188 pence per litre. The average price of unleaded petrol is just over 182 pence a litre. Our business correspondent, Paul Kelso, has more on the rising cost of fuel.
The car is crucial to the school run for Rosie and Mum Amy. But filling up is a nasty surprise, one we're going to have to all get used to.
It made me feel a bit sick just watching it go up and up and up. I couldn't believe that it was that much. Looking at where we're spending every week, not going on foreign holidays, where's our money going? I feel like we'd already been doing quite a good job of tightening our belts.
For unleaded petrol and diesel, the £100 tank is now the norm. Motoring groups want an immediate 10p cut to the taxes that make up 45% of pump prices. The Prime Minister suggested retailers still haven't passed on a 5p cut made in March.
What I want to see is those cuts in taxation not just swallowed up in one gulp without touching the gullet of the fuel companies. I want to see those cuts having an impact on the pumps.
But with oil prices still high, up almost 57% this year, that cut has long since been negated by rising wholesale prices. Not least because sanctions against Russia, a major supplier of diesel, have cut supply. Retailers insist they're not profiteering.
Our members don't want to sell at these prices, but they can't sell at a loss. Many of our members know their customers personally. They come in on a regular basis and they know the pressures that this puts on household budgets. But unfortunately, we buy on a wholesale basis and we have to make money out of it.
Petrol and diesel are at record levels, but it is not unusual as here to find prices at the pump more than 10p higher than that. And you don't have to be a driver to be affected. These prices are nearly 40% higher than a year ago, and fuel is so fundamental to the economy. They're contributing nearly 1% to general inflation. Everyone is going to pay a price. Charities like Brent Community Transport are feeling the squeeze. They provide transport for the elderly, the infirm and youth groups.
Oh, wow. It makes the one down the road looks cheap. This is already £1.95.
Chairman Moses is counting the cost of filling each of his 22 vehicles.
£137. 12 months ago, and I'm really stretching it 12 months ago, it could even be less, I was filling up for merely 80. So that's a huge, and there's no extra money coming in, so it has to come from our reserves. How long we can sustain that, I really don't know.
We do know prices won't be going into reverse anytime soon. Paul Kelso, Sky News.
Well, plenty then about the cost of living to put to our panel. Let me introduce them. We've got Bola Sol, a personal finance expert, with us. Also, Sara Ogilvie is Policy Director at the Child Poverty Action Group. They're with me in the studio, and joining us remotely is Frank van Lerven, an economist with the New Economics Foundation. A very good evening to you all. Well, we've got so many questions because this is such a wide-ranging crisis. So let's kick off. As I say, many people have been sending in questions throughout the day to us here at Sky News. Masood has our first question, which is, why are electricity, gas and petrol going up if we don't buy from Russia? Well, Bola, that is the point, that we get a relatively small amount of our energy from Russia. We know all about the problems caused by that. So why are prices rising so steeply for energy?
Yeah, even though our UK supply is privatised, we have to think about the fact that prices are going to compare in comparison to what the market is doing internationally. So it's going to reflect off of that, irrespective of us not getting most of our supply from Russia. Yeah,
I mean, the macroeconomic view, Frank, the fact is that even if we don't get much of our energy, particularly gas, from Russia, it's about supply and demand. So if other countries that do get large amounts of their gas from Russia then access the markets that we access, the price goes up.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So the recent jump in fuel prices, it highlights our vulnerability to foreign oil. Russia has curtailed its production and is shifting its supplies to Asia and away from Europe, which is driving a further spike in increases. But there's another kind of macroeconomic force at play, which is basically that the dollar has increased quite a lot since the Federal Reserve Bank has raised interest rates, which creates more demand and makes the dollar more valuable. And possibly there's an argument that since Brexit, the value of the pound has gone down, and since we buy our oil and petrol in dollars, effectively that's made it more expensive.
OK, that's the exchange rate. Follow-on question from our next viewer, Sam asks, I'll stick with you, Frank, because it's, as I say, closely related. Why is the cost of fuel on the rise? Is it because of Brexit or the war in Ukraine? Or I'll add in a multiplicity of factors.
Well, yeah, I mean, kind of coming back to what I was saying, there is an argument that Brexit knocked 20% of the value of the pound against the dollar. Oil prices are effectively in dollars, and hence the petrol has increased. That's raised the cost by more than 25%. But the flip side of this is actually that it's more that the value of the dollar has actually increased. Maybe by the way, I'm neither a Brexiteer or a Remainer. I'm quite neutral on that. But the Fed has effectively raised rates. That means that the returns on American assets are basically more profitable, creating more demand for the dollar, increasing the value against other currencies, especially the pound. So Actually, the price of Brent is still, in dollar terms, 20% below its 2008 all-time high. The dollar is about 28.5% stronger than it was in 2008. So Brent has peaked at about 74 pounds per barrel in 2008. Today, it's at 95 pounds. So it's still a third more expensive. And I'd actually probably lean more towards the side that this has more to do with the fact that the dollar has increased quite a lot in value, and it has a lot to do with some of the macroeconomics.
Well, thank you for explaining, the effect of exchange rates. And we get that you are a dispassionate observer. And can I just ask you, Bola, on, as Frank's describing there, the change particularly in sterling versus the dollar, that devaluation of the currency, of course, puts up prices in so many other areas as well, particularly those that are imported.
Absolutely. It just means that we get less for our money, and it means our money can't go as far as it was going before. So we just have to think very wisely about how we're currently spending.
The pound in your pocket, as a Prime Minister long ago famously coined the phrase. Let's get another question, and I want to put this to you, Sara. Steph asks, what's being done to ease the burden on the younger generation? We've talked about so many areas where, particularly housing, where the young are missing out, but there are many other burdens as well.
I have to say, Dermot, the answer to that is not a lot. You know, we heard from the government a couple of weeks ago, they announced a package for helping people to deal with the cost of living crisis. And one thing that was really noticeable about that is that families from a low income in particular got a lump sum, but they didn't get any extra money for their children. And we all know that children cost money. So, you know, speaking about fuel costs, if you're in a family and you've got 1 kid or 2 kids, it's going to cost you more to heat the house or to boil the water. You're going to have to buy more food. So families in particular are really suffering with this cost of living crisis, and government just isn't putting money in their pocket to help deal with that. We also know that kids have really suffered during COVID. We know that if you come from a low-income family, your educational experience is much more difficult than if you're from a more well-off family. So something government could do is think about free school meals for more children. We learned today that 800,000 children living in poverty don't qualify for a free school meal.
800,000? I did not know that. We know about the fuss that took place last year about continuing free school meals during parts of the pandemic and how the government had to more or less have its arm twisted to continue with them. But there are 800,000 who miss out. Just tell us a bit more about that.
So what's happened is over the past year or so, actually the number of children on free school meals has gone up. But there's a real gap between because the eligibility criteria is so restrictive, you can still be a family living in poverty and you don't qualify for free school meals. So what that means is you've got, as I say, 800,000 kids we've worked out today are going into school. The families are really struggling to pay the bills. Obviously, families will do anything to make sure their kids can eat.
So, Sara, can I say these are families who are receiving benefits officially classed as in poverty, but they don't qualify. How does that work? Just tell us a bit about the criteria.
So the mechanics are that if you are in a family that is on universal credit but is also earning, which you know many families are, if you're earning any more than £7,000, then you don't qualify for free school meals. And that sounds a bit technical, but it just means that, as I say, thousands and thousands of children are going into school and they're at risk of going hungry.
My goodness me. Well, thanks for illustrating that. Thanks for highlighting that, Sara. Another question, I'm going to put this one then back to you, Frank. We're back into so many people rightly concerned about the cost of fuel. And Peter wants to know, I suppose many people wonder this, why is diesel more expensive in the United Kingdom than petrol, whereas in mainland Europe it's the other way round? Do we know this? Because, I mean, diesel did used to be cheaper in the UK than petrol, but it flipped at some point.
I'm going to be totally honest with you. I am not a petrol specialist.
Anyone know? No. All I know is, as the former driver of a diesel, that it did used to be, and we were encouraged to do so by Labour. It was at the time that thought that diesel was less polluting than petrol, so there was an encouragement to use more diesel vehicles. And then, of course, over the course of the last decade and a bit, we've been discouraged because of some of the particulates in diesel has now been discovered. Didn't know that back in the early 2000s, or maybe we did, and maybe the government just didn't know. Bola, do you know why it's more expensive in the UK than petrol, whereas in mainland Europe it's the other way around?
I think it might have something to do with the demand in this country for it, and potentially if there's less demand for it, the prices have to be higher, which is why, in general, some people say things like, oh, what if we stop driving, for example, and will the petrol prices go down? And it's very likely that's not going to happen either. So
yeah, well, petrol does go down if you don't drive at all, but so many people, of course, have to travel. Bola, Darren asked this. I have a choice. Council tax or electricity and gas and food. It's not hard to choose the winner. Well, you know, you've got to eat. So yeah, I know which one you choose, Darren. But then, of course, you get into an awful lot of trouble with the energy companies and your local authority. So it's a dilemma so many millions of people are facing.
Absolutely. I think what people need to do now more than ever is speak to their service providers. It's so easy for you to feel alone in this situation, but we aren't causing this situation and our income isn't rising. So as a result of that, we need to start having very honest conversations with the people who provide us with services and say, this is my current income and this is what I can afford, and see if there's anything that can be done to work around your situation. Yeah,
so get advice on that. And Sara, as I say, that's a stark choice faced by so many families at the moment.
It really is. All year, families have been telling us that they've got nothing left to cut back on. And, you know, the current cost of living crisis is a real real challenge. But before that, families had the £20 cut to universal credit. They had to go through COVID, which cost families loads and loads of money. And to be completely honest, there are some really long-term issues with the social security system that means that there's been this break between what families need and what they're able to get in order to make sure that their kids can live a healthy, happy life. So things are really, really tough for families because they just didn't have anywhere to go. And this crisis is really hitting them hard.
Yeah, and what about help? I mean, you know, we've had a couple of packages from the government we know about, but people are still getting in more and more difficult circumstances.
I mean, I won't pretend that government hasn't done anything. And, you know, it did announce that it's going to give families who are using the social security system £650, you know, to see them through until next spring. But to be honest, like, you know, as we've heard, costs are so high. Families are already in so much debt, and this crisis has been going on all year in addition to the other problems families face. So really that money is just going to kind of maybe get them out of a little bit of the debt that they're in already, but it's really not going to help families see themselves through this summer holidays, when you've got to do activities for your kids, when you've got to feed them more, and how it's going to deal with seeing them through what could potentially be like a quite long, cold winter. That's, you know, it's really, really concerning for people.
And Bola, is that one of the problems with, you know, one-off handouts, is that we don't know how long this is going to go on, but the predictions are that it could be for quite some time, perhaps quite a few years, that one-off handouts, well, then they get spent, they're an immediate sticking plaster for the problem. Isn't the more fundamental way to do it to make structural changes to benefits, to living wages, and indeed to taxes?
Absolutely, that's the best way. I know people want handouts and I get why, but as you said, we're going to have to look at what happens in 6 months when it gets cold and we see a rise in energy prices. We can't keep asking for handouts every 3 to 6 months or every quarter. We have to look at long-term solutions, and the government have to look at long-term solutions so that we can all live above the breadline.
And Frank, can I ask you about that? Because if we get on to the government, and, you know, they're hinting at it now, making tax changes, cutting VAT, cutting income tax. That, though, impacts on the debt, on the money that the government's borrowing, and therefore the servicing of that debt.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we should definitely think about this in different ways, though, because sorts of fiscal stimuluses, that is, like an increase in public expenditure, can increase growth, and that also means higher tax revenues. It also means that the so-called debt to GDP ratio might actually fall over time. So there's a case for it if you use public expenditure in a calculated way, in ways that boost growth, that raise incomes, and therefore raise taxes, that can actually lead to, you know, a lower level of debt to GDP. On the other hand, I mean, there is a case that if it's not used wisely, that yes, you'll have a higher level of debt, and without any interventions from the central bank, and absent any kind of global macroeconomic forces, you'll probably you could see a higher interest rate as well, or definitely higher interest and debt servicing costs.
Is it a bit of a gamble, though, that tactic you described there of cutting taxes to encourage growth, in that there's going to be at least a lag until that growth comes through and the revenues from it? And what do you do in between time with interest rates rising?
Yeah, personally, if we were going to, I actually think tax reform should be kind of done the other way around, and we should start thinking about actually how we can reform the tax system so that those with the broadest shoulders actually shoulder most of the burden of the cost of living crisis. And we should use public expenditure rather than taxing. We should be investing in retrofitting homes, investing in renewable sources of energy, things that basically, you know, invest now in the climate crisis. Otherwise, the costs in 10 years' time will be far, far more. Furthermore, those types of, you know, you talked a bit earlier about, you know, the effects of consumption and sticking plasters. Tax cuts have short-term effects on the economy. Investments, creating assets over the long-term, infrastructure assets, investing in education and in health, those have long-term benefits for the economy that can change the productive kind of trajectory of the economy and growth as well. So I'm more dubious about tax cuts, to be honest. If they should go anywhere, it should be for lower income households. But overall, I'd say at least in terms of reforming the tax system, we should think about it the other way around.
Well, plenty of great suggestions from you all so far, and because of that, you're going to stay here. Well, listen, you're going to stay here anyway, because we're going to take a break. You're watching this special question and answer programme about the cost of living. Next, we're going to be asking what options the government is looking at to combat these rising prices and the squeeze on household incomes. Stay with us.
Hello there. Coming up tonight at 9 p.m, I'll be speaking to Dame Emma Thompson and her co-star Daryl McCormack about their latest film and how Emma felt empowered to do a film all about sex over the age of 60. Plus, she has some strong words for the government about the Rwanda migrant scheme. Also on the programme, Michael Lewis, author of The Premonition and the Fifth Risk, which is currently being made into a Netflix series by the Obama production company, and Catherine Birbalsingh on why she's been named Britain's strictest headmistress. That's all coming up at 9 o'clock on Sky News. Don't miss it. It's a good one.
I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent.
Well, there's a real sense now that people are beginning to expect that this whole airlift is coming to an end, and they're really, really desperate. We saw snatch squads going in, grabbing people and putting them into trucks.
You either live and recover, or you die.
Okay, so that's like a war.
That's the war, yes.
We help you understand the world with us.
Over the past 24 hours, the soldiers have been attacked on a number of occasions. It's really sending a clear message that Venezuela is eager for change. We've been crushed.
To take you to the heart of stories that shape our world.
They were convinced the United States would become hooked. Well, they were right.
An enormous explosion that's just come down. I think it was a monster's just landed in between us.
The information on this could bring down the entire network, not just in Iraq and Syria, but across the world.
Sara could throw, but the pig withdrawn. It's so hot.
The inspiration behind our product came from understanding how big of a problem livestock methane emissions were.
Welcome back. You're watching a special question and answer programme about the cost of living crisis. And the Prime Minister has been to Blackpool today attempting to rebrand his image after 4 in 10 of his own MPs refused to support him in a confidence vote, you remember, on Monday night. In a wide-ranging speech, Mr Johnson warned that prices will remain high for quite a while to come and said there was no quick fix for the Ukraine conflict. But he said the government would do more to help people on low incomes, pledging to make it easier for those whose wages are topped up by the benefit system to become homeowners. Our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, has more.
For many, this is the front line of the cost of living crisis. The spiralling price of buying or renting the roof over your head as bills of all kind are increasing too. Owning rather than renting a home can make a massive difference for those on the lowest incomes. Andrew has benefited from a pilot scheme that gave him the right to buy his housing association home.
Winning and also security. The issue is some rules and regulations change, and I've heard hearsay of they were talking about because my children are grown up now, I've got a 3-bedroomed house, that they might want to move me into a 1-bedroom flat. even though this is a home for the children, the kids come back here. Hopefully one of their grandkids will as well. And I just want to keep the property. And this is a guaranteed way of keeping the property now, because I bought it. They can't turn around and say, we need to transfer you to a flat. It's great.
Boris Johnson in Blackpool today and in need of a political rebuild, expanding the right to buy pilot scheme, the first building block.
So you tell me when confidence enough?
And with it, a promise of more precision engineering to bring down costs. This is a speech designed to appeal to his rebellious backbenchers as much as the public.
It's time for the government to stop spending and to start cutting taxes and cutting regulation. Sometimes the best way the government can help is simply to get out of the way, to do less or to do it better or simply not at all.
The PM covered everything from tax cuts to olive tariffs to closing ticket offices, but eventually got to his second big housing plan.
I can announce a comprehensive review of the mortgage market. Reporting back this autumn, it will look at how we can give our nation of aspiring homeowners better access to low deposit mortgages.
And a promise to refocus.
That we will be able to get on with the mission on which this government was elected, to unite and level up across our country. So that no matter where you are born or what's your background, we will give you the chance to fulfil your potential.
Boris Johnson's big argument here today is that the government cannot spend its way out of the cost of living crisis, so he wants to reform to cut costs. Today, housing, soon childcare and transport. But to deliver meaningful change, he's going to need unity from his cabinet and the party, and MPs are going to be looking to see whether the country is with him. Business owners suffer at work and at home. This restaurant opened months ago. The manager says rising prices means fewer customers and less money for the family at the end of the day.
Everything is going up, absolutely everything. We cannot put the prices high up because we're going to end up closing the shop. So we're trying to survive the best we can.
Behind the arcades, Blackpool is one of the most deprived parts of the country. Boris Johnson promised long-term wins for the lucky few. But in places like this, not everyone can afford to wait their turn. Sam Coates, Sky News, Blackpool.
Well, we've got plenty more questions concerning some of the issues and potential solutions that the Prime Minister was raising there in Blackpool. Let's put them to our panel of experts. And we start with our next question. It's from Rowley, who said it's clear to see that many households are facing significant cost of living rises, and this is going to result in people losing their houses and their jobs. Why can't the government see this and act now? And Rowley's describing, I suppose, the classic features of a recession. Bola, that is the issue. If this gets work, many people could lose their jobs, lose their houses, and that has a huge economic effect.
Absolutely. The idea of, for example, raising a wage or something of the sort isn't going to help, because I do believe the cost of living crisis, prices are still going to increase. Unfortunately, I don't feel we have seen the worst of it. And we're not in a recession yet, but many say that a recession is coming, and I do agree with that. So I think the government are more likely to be reactive to certain job losses and housing issues as opposed to proactive.
Do you think that's what the government is doing now? It's been reactive. What we've talked about, the couple of packages that they came up with earlier in the year. You think they should get on the front foot, get ahead of it?
Absolutely. I think what's hard, it's hard to measure exactly what's going to happen until it happens. So I do get the reason for them pacing themselves through everything going on.
Sara, I mean, this is the issue Rolly raises there. That so many households facing significant cost of living rises, and then if the economy really does go wrong, and remember the OECD are forecasting zero growth next year for the United Kingdom, if the jobs start going and house prices start collapsing, we could be in real trouble. Families could be in real trouble.
I think that's really true. And I think you're right. Government has got to think long term, and it's got to think about the structural way that our social security system works, so that if things do get worse, we're ready to help people out and make sure that we can continue through the crisis and come out the other end. That's why these one-off things don't work, because they don't give people security. And it means that if things get worse, government is going to have to keep reacting and reacting. What it should be doing is looking at the social security system and other bits, you know, of the state and the support that can be provided. But look at it and work out, how do we get money to families? How do we make sure families are getting enough money through that system so that they can really live and so that they can get through things? And how do we make sure that families are in a position whereby children can eat and they can have their homes heated, that parents, if they can work, that they can then be supported to find jobs when they come available? But, you know, there's also loads of reasons why people aren't even working at the moment. You know, if you're a parent and you've got young kids, it's often really hard to fit a full-time job around childcare. And we know that childcare is hugely expensive. So why doesn't government think about looking at childcare? Or perhaps you're in a family with a disabled child, or you have disabilities yourself. Then again, you might struggle to get a full-time job or to work at all. Government really needs to be looking after these people now and into the future.
Yeah, ahead of it, yeah. Can I ask you though, Sara, how flexible and reactive universal credit is? Because, you know, we saw it from its genesis, its implementation, that was problematic. But then did it come into its own during the pandemic? It seemed to get the money pretty quickly to people. Something like that could be used again?
So in practical terms, the universal credit system did hold up better than some of us were worried that it would do. You know, the technology just about worked. We were able to get more people onto that system. So I suppose we can assume that if lots of people do lose their jobs in future, that response will be replicated. That's great, but ultimately, if there's not enough money in the social security system for families or individuals to really live on, then there's an extent to which it doesn't matter if the money's getting to you quickly, and you need to have enough in the first place. But there's also, again, so there's kind of issues like the amount of money in the social security system. There's issues like the benefit cap for the 2-child limit that kind of limit the extent that families can get money out of it. But then there's also kind of, you might think that they're technical issues, but there's a thing called the 5-week wait. And that means if you want to claim universal credit, you can't get your first payment until 5 weeks after you've claimed. Now, you can get a loan to cover that period, but it means that you're going into this really difficult period of your life already in debt, essentially. And things like that don't work in this kind of situation.
OK, we've got a question coming up on the minimum wage, but just on this question from Rowley. Frank, I mean, as I say, there's a big question here. He's more or less, as I say, describing a recession. How likely do you think this is, that we can see people losing houses, losing jobs, that we get to that situation?
So I think there's two things to consider here. First of all, when recessions happen, they can take place in two formats. One is job losses, but the second, which we saw post-2009, was rather than job losses, is reduction in wages or stagnant wages. And you know, I think this is something that's not actually discussed enough currently, but we were effectively sleepwalking into this cost of living crisis. A decade of, you know, stagnant wages meant that you know, when prices started to go up, we were in a very feeble position. Alongside, you know, everything Sara said, by the way, I was just nodding my head because I completely agree with it. We had the weakest social security system coming into this crisis, and if the 2008 global, you know, financial crisis revealed the frailties of our banking system, the COVID pandemic revealed the weakness of our social security system, and we do need a permanent solution to it. And we need to make sure that over the long term, effectively, we can make sure that people have, you know, a minimum income that kind of leads to a decent standard of living.
Frank, I'm interrupting there because that's our next questioner asked that. Dan asked, and you know, you mentioned falling wages. Well, you know, there's one end of the wage scale that the government can control, the national living wage, the minimum wage. Dan asks, would a substantial raise to the minimum wage help with the cost of living crisis? Is that part of the policy prescription you would recommend to the government?
Personally, yes. Yeah, as I was saying, you know, households were already approaching the current crisis in a financially vulnerable position due to like 13 years of a real fall in average earnings. And across 2 decades leading up to 2020, the poorest 10% of families saw their income grow by just 3% after housing costs, which is 6 times slower than the average. So there is a case that we should be increasing the minimum wage to £15, which I'm not against. I'd say that would definitely help the poorest households. It would probably be one of the strongest levelling up measures, with 33% of employees in London benefiting compared to 51% of the employees. And there's a case that it would also substantially increase taxation to over 30 billion. And just on that note, I just wanted to make one point, because we heard Boris Johnson talking about cutting taxes and that as a solution to the cost of living. That's in the current situation of the recession and cost of living, that's kind of like taking a bucket of water and throwing it on somebody when they're thirsty. It is a very kind of a non-targeted way to deal with the issues and the primary problems facing our country.
So a bucket of water and throwing it on someone when they're thirsty. So Bola, this question from Dan: a substantial rise to the national living wage. I mean, it clearly would help with the cost of living crisis, but how substantial would it have to be?
Yeah, personally, I agree. That's definitely something that's needed, and something that will definitely help, hopefully in the short to mid-term, on the basis that the cost of living crisis doesn't continue to go up to a level where, even when it is raised, it's continued to be a problem. So I would say potentially, as Frank said, up to about £15 per hour, definitely for those on.
But what about, the small business owners in particular? They say, well, look, we're under stress and strain as well. And, the national insurance rises put stresses and strains upon their wage bill. This would add even more to it.
Yeah, I think that's more a question for Frank. I'm a small business owner myself, so I question what that means for me. But unfortunately, I will also be reactive.
OK, well, listen, I've got another question here. We're back to drivers and the roads. Don't know who can actually answer this. Probably only the government. Shoms asks, why hasn't the government temporarily abolished road tax to help with the cost of living? Frank, I mean, because that's all about, there is no such thing as road tax. We know it's vehicle excise duty, goes into the general fund of the Treasury. As a cyclist, I know this because I'm always, and as a driver, I'm always asked why I don't pay road tax. You know that as well. I can see you smiling. It goes into the general fund. But, I mean, it certainly would help drivers.
So yeah, I think, first of all, we should bear in mind that fuel duty was cut by 5p in the
I think this is about
budget.
vehicle excise duty. Road tax, taxation.
Yeah, generally speaking, I personally think that there could be certain benefits to it, but they would be minimal. And what we should really be doing and thinking about is cutting expenses for public transport and increasing the capacity of public transport. And the reason being is that those cuts will not filter down to, again, the most vulnerable and poorest households that are most affected by the cost of living.
Back to your bucket of water there, Frank. Roy asks, well, Sara, this is self-evident, but he asks, is it cheaper to use public transport rather than filling up your car on average each month? Well, how long's a piece of string? Some public transport is awfully expensive and is pretty infrequent. It depends where you live.
Yeah, it's a real tough one because, we've heard how expensive it is to fill up your car. But if you're a family and you've got with 2 kids or 3 kids or 4 kids, buying train tickets, getting them all on the bus, it's going to be really expensive, but also it's really impractical as well. And you might have to drop them off at different places at different times. Life is complicated and difficult. So yeah, and if you're a parent, one thing that is often a factor actually in parents deciding where they're going to take a job, it's because it's close to home or close to the school. So transport costs are already a big factor. And if you have to limit the jobs you take to the area really close to where you live or where your kid's going to school, that often means you can't get the best kind of job that you could do. So that's another way that families' incomes are being restricted. So yeah, a fundamental look at improving transport costs and accessibility for families would be really welcome.
Yeah, Bola, I mean, that would make a big difference, wouldn't it? Proper investment in public transport infrastructure.
Absolutely, and it very much depends on your location as well. So, for example, if you're living in London, the cost of public transport is ridiculously expensive. This is why a lot of people do prefer to work from home so that they can save money. So it's a question of what's going to be done to target that.
It's a good point. Could see more working from home. But of course, I mean, you mentioned about the expense of public transport in London. It is relatively plentiful. If you live in other places, particularly rural areas, we are talking, on the spite of Boris Johnson saying he's a fan of the buses, and I think some time back another of his announcements concerned a bus strategy that didn't seem to come to pass. You see one a day, if that, and it costs you £6 to get down the road. And if you want to come back again, you have to wait till tomorrow.
Absolutely. I used to live outside of London during university, and I saw 2 buses an hour, so I got a car.
Well, no, but that actually encapsulates it. Let's get a last question in this section. Layla asks, if we all stopped driving, would this bring down the cost of fuel at the pumps? Yeah, maybe they'd be offering you incentives to buy it. An economist can answer this because it's about, human behaviour, isn't it? That if the demand goes down and there's plenty of supply, then the prices drop.
Yeah, definitely. I think in the introduction to the program, there was some discussion about this, whether actually, retailers are testing or speculating as to how much they can get out of these price rises, and I definitely would say that there's a possibility that the price would go down if all of a sudden people stop buying petrol.
Yeah, but of course, Bola, as you were saying there, the reality is so many people can't. They'd like to, but they can't.
Agreed. Yeah, absolutely. There's not much you can do given the situation. It's not necessarily in our hands. All we can do is respond to what's happening in the economy.
Yeah, and down tools if we can. But as I say, in many cases, that's an impossibility. You're watching a special question and answer programme about the cost of living crisis. Coming up next, we're asking whether scrapping VAT on fuel could alleviate some of the energy crisis. Welcome back. You're watching a question and answer programme about the cost of living crisis. In Northern Ireland, we've been talking a lot about fuel. Well, fuel is currently less expensive than in the rest of the United Kingdom. That's partially down to a government website which lets drivers know where the cheapest petrol and diesel can be found. The Consumer Council updates its fuel price index every week to tell consumers the current average prices so they can shop around. Our Ireland correspondent, Stephen Murphy, has been doing just that.
Northern Ireland has the cheapest fuel prices in the UK. Not that motorists here would know it.
Is it Northern Ireland?
Does that come as a surprise?
A wee bit. It's extortionate.
It feels like everywhere's kind of keeps going up and up and up.
Prices are usually 3 to 4% lower than the rest of the UK, where one simple tool could help make a difference. One advantage motorists here do have is this, a Consumer Council fuel price tracker. It tells people exactly what the average prices should be in their area around Northern Ireland. The AA says that this greater transparency helps keep prices lower, and it should be rolled out everywhere in the UK. Even the government-funded agency behind the tracker doesn't think it's solely responsible for lower prices, but it does say that it could help.
The AA have been very nice and have said that they think that our tool is definitely helping keep prices down in Northern Ireland. We'd be a little bit more modest, but certainly having a tool for consumers that enables them to see what the highest, lowest and average price in their town is helps people to shop around and get a good deal.
When motorists know how much they should be charged in their community, it can help them make a more informed choice where to fill up.
A tool like that would be helpful, of course it would, yeah. But I do shop around for fuel. I mean, I'll hold out and wait and go to the cheaper one.
It costs money to shop around. We buy local and we stay local with the diesel and petrol prices, but it's got crazy, business are starting to struggle.
Fuel retailers say they dread each price increase.
You're looking, how am I going to go and put this price up on the totem pole? And, people are going to say, this is, crazy prices here. But at the end of the day, because of the cost, we just can't sell it at a loss. We have to make some sort of margin and profit on it.
Could picking up the pump be less painful with price transparency? The experience in Northern Ireland suggests it could. Stephen Murphy, Sky News in County Tyrone.
Well, let's answer some more of your questions about fuel and the general cost of living crisis with our panel of experts. And this from Rich, which relates to what Stephen's been reporting on in Northern Ireland. Rich asks, would it be viable for the government to introduce a fuel cap rate for petrol and diesel? Frank, what do you think about that? So, there's the energy price cap. Would it work for petrol and diesel?
Yeah, definitely. There's an issue right now which possibly, petrol retailers are not. There was a fuel duty cut earlier. They're not. This is why the app that that was explained earlier might be working quite well. Is because retailers are not necessarily passing that on to their customers. So there's what's called price gouging possibly going on. So a cap might help. At the same time, I know this might be a controversial position, but it should be one that we think about for the long term, and that is eventually over time, we kind of need petrol and oil prices to increase. We want carbon taxes to take place. It's not something for the short term, but we need to think of, again, a long-term solution to this. And I don't think a price cap then is that solution, because eventually we want people's behavior to change and move more towards electric vehicles.
You're right. Either the climate crisis is there or it isn't. We can't ignore it, just temporarily, I suppose. Bola, but a fuel cap rate for petrol and diesel, and take on board, reflect on that Stephen Murphy report. Even short of that, a bit of naming and shaming of those that charge the highest prices, and let's publicise those that charge the cheapest ones, so then the consumers can make their choices.
Absolutely, that would be fantastic for everyone across the board, including myself, to see exactly how that works and who is profiting from what. And I think we could do with a cap, but the question is, are we going to get it, and are the government going to give it to us?
Yeah. The problem is, though, isn't it, if you find it's 2p a litre cheaper 50 miles away, then you do a 100-mile round trip to fill your tank up, and it's a little bit wasted.
Yeah.
OK, got another question from Mike saying, well, Are other countries facing the same significant increase in fuel prices? Anyone know what other countries are doing? I know that in some other countries, in France certainly, they've managed to keep prices down a little bit more, Frank?
Yeah, it's actually the only country that I think it's got higher petrol prices right now is France. Outside of that, we're one of the highest and high income countries.
OK, and why doesn't, we had a question from Cal saying, why doesn't the government get rid of the VAT on fuel for a while? Sara, this is back to what we've been asking about, you know, in terms of overall tax cuts. But VAT on fuel, it's quite targeted. We were prevented from doing that in the United Kingdom while members of the European Union. It was mentioned by the Vote Leave campaign as one of the big Brexit bonuses, but it hasn't happened.
That is something government could do, sure, but I think there's lots of other things it could do too that either would be targeted at those most in need, or from the perspective of children and families, you know, it's something that responds to their needs. So if it wants to do something for everyone, it could give families more child benefit. It could put every pupil on a free school meals. So that's indirectly giving families the equivalent of tax cuts, but in a targeted way that means that children are really feeling the benefit of that in a way that they're not going to do from lots of these other measures that we're hearing about.
I seem to be confusing our producers because I'm picking these questions as they come, but hey, they're all good ones. Bola, Terry asked this, you know, we've done the international European comparisons there. Terry asked this, Ireland has actually slashed public transport fares by 20%. We were asking about that, you know, how expensive public transport is. Cut by 20% until next year to help with the crisis. Do we think a similar incentive could work here? I'll add in there, Terry, I know that in Germany, they've introduced a remarkable scheme for all transport throughout the entirety of Germany, which is a massive country, at €9 for a month's travel on its transport network. Something like that, something comprehensive, make a big splash. Do you think that would work, Bola?
I think it absolutely would work. I would be happy at £9, for example, for that type of service. I think what people have to put into consideration is that, in a good way, that would actually drive up the demand for people to travel, because they'll say, well, prices have been cut back. I am more inclined to actually go out now because I feel like I'm saving a bit of money. So I definitely think a little cutback will definitely have a good increase in demand.
OK, we've had plenty about transport and fuel. We're talking generally about the cost of living crisis, so let's expand it. And Frank, this is to you, and it brings in what the Prime Minister was saying today about he wants to get more and more people onto the property ladder to be able to buy their own homes. But of course, that then begs questions about supply and demand again. And Anonymous asked what actually makes house prices so high. Tell us about the economic forces that seem to drive house prices up and up in the United Kingdom.
Wow, OK. So, I mean, that's a very complicated question, so I'll try to be quick. In very short terms, basically, the home since the 1980s has stopped being a home. It's become a financial asset. And it's no longer kind of used as something for people to live in, but it's for people to speculate. And yes, we're commonly told that there's definitely issues of not building enough homes. I'm very sympathetic to that. Definitely in London, you see the wrong types of homes being built, lots of these expensive luxury types of homes rather than more affordable types of homes, and that we definitely need. But at the same time, there's two other things that are happening, and that's on the demand side. And that is that we have a banking system that basically can lend ad nauseum for property. And so when you have an infinite supply of money chasing a finite supply of housing, the housing price is going to increase. The second side effect of that, of the house being a financial asset, is that we effectively export our housing stock. We have a lot of foreign investment speculating in our housing stock. Again, leads to that kind of infinite amount of money chasing the...
OK, I get it. When you said export our housing stock, I had visions there of container ships with loads of bricks and staircases. I get it. I see what you're saying there. Listen, from the macroeconomic, well, let's end on this from Margot, who asks, just states, really. Sara, take this on. I don't know if you did. I had cookery lessons at school. Now children don't. Simple recipe leaflets would help. Do food banks offer fresh food? Well, it's a bit of both. But this idea that, you know, that would help, perhaps if you could prepare from raw ingredients, might help a little bit?
So I suppose there's two things I'd say in response to that. First of all is, in direct response to the question, children do have those kind of lessons at school. But if you're from a family from a low income, children are expected to bring the ingredients in themselves and families can't even afford that. So that's another way that children from a low income are being cut out of the education system. So actually, even something that sounds like a simple solution excludes children in education. But to look at the bigger picture altogether, I understand the sentiment, but really, there isn't a food crisis here in the country. There's an income crisis. Families don't have enough money to get by at the moment. And, fresh vegetables and, cooking is great, but you need fuel for it. If you've got children, you need more food. So ultimately, it doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. And I think government's got to get a grip on it.
OK. Bola, quick thought, though, about making your own meals from basic ingredients. Would that help in terms of personal finance? Is it actually cheaper? We know it's more time-consuming, but is it actually cheaper?
Yes, definitely. Of course, you look at, for example, takeaway services, and you find that if you just had the raw ingredients, it would be much cheaper for you to make it at home. So right now, what people should probably do is look at the supermarket they go to. Is there a cheaper supermarket they could go to and maybe get the same product for a decent quality as well? So that's definitely something people need to look at.
There's some great advice from you all, both the macro and right down to the personal advice, as we expected. That's why we selected our panel. Bola Sol, thank you very much indeed. Sara Ogilvie, very good to see you. And Frank van Lerven, excellent analysis. Thank you all. And you're watching Sky News Tonight. Coming up on Sky News Tonight at 8 o'clock, we turn to the situation in Ukraine where 2 British men have been sentenced to death by a Russian-backed court. The Foreign Secretary has condemned it.
The plan is to take the political temperature midweek. So we'll be discussing the biggest stories of the week so far, talking about what's still to come, having a look at Prime Minister's questions, of course, and getting a reaction from politicians, plus our very own viewers. And we'll have analysis from my Sky News colleagues.
The Take with Sophie Rich on Sky News.
The world seems to be becoming more and more divided. Issues around politics, culture, the pandemic are resulting in vastly opposing viewpoints, causing real rifts between us. I want to get in the middle of those debates. I want to better understand where each stance comes from and whether there's room for compromise. Join me, Trevor Phillips, as we look to find